come to talk to you today about recent work in Western Cardiff in a place called Trelai Park, which you can see here. I should say at this point as well that the work is collaborative. So my friend and colleague, Professor Neil Sharple, is a big part of the research, and everything that we've done is part of a massive community archaeology project called CAER Heritage, which I'll say a bit more about in a second, and which John gave a slight introduction to. I thought I'd start with this photograph though, because well, I quite like it, but also one of the reasons I quite like it is that anyone who's familiar with Cardiff will know that the sort of the northern part of Cardiff is framed by the low hills, which I suppose you could call the sort of the foothills of the Brecon Beacons, if you will. This one here in particular on the left-hand side, this very sort of flat-topped hill just there. You probably can't quite see it there, but there are what appear to be two little diddly tiny pimples on the top of it, which, if you've ever been on the top of the Garth, which is that hill, you will know are Bronze Age burial mounds. And the Bronze Age is a period that we know about in Wales mainly from that kind of evidence, from the burial evidence, but also the metalwork. So large numbers of metalwork finds have been recovered, increasingly so through PAS and things like that. Settlement, though, has been seemingly much harder to locate, often only found through excavations where people have been targeting other kinds of sites and then found that a Bronze Age settlement kind of predates or underlies the later material. But we've been very fortunate to find Bronze Age settlement evidence, and extremely well preserved Bronze Age settlement evidence in this wonderful leisure park in Western Cardiff. The project, as I mentioned, is part of a kind of much broader scheme of work that's been going on for almost 15 years now, called CAER Heritage, and it's ostensibly a big community archaeology, but also history, heritage, all sorts of different things project that's focused, very much place-based and focused in Western Cardiff, in a part of Cardiff known as, well, it's often collectively known as Ely, but actually it really is separated into two distinct wards, the northern part being Ely and the southern part being Caerau. The name of the southern ward, Caerau, is actually derived from this quite wonderful site, which a lot of our original work kind of focused around, and which we now have a wonderful community heritage centre in the kind of the shadow of. This is Caerau Camp, which you can see here at the bottom of the page, or Caerau Hillfort, which is fantastic, kind of one of the most spectacular hill forts in Southeast Wales, one of the largest hill forts in Southeast Wales. Everything that we've done has involved local people in helping to discover the stories of the place that they live. So we're the kind of facilitators that help local people tell their own stories, and in doing so have all sorts of life opportunities that they may not have. These are areas of Cardiff which suffer from really bad social and economic deprivation, and archaeology is part of the kind of the regeneration, I guess, of this area, you could say. We've been going for a long time, won lots of awards, and we're still going. But I'm not going to talk more about the kind of the community aspects. I'm going to talk more about some of the research aspects of the project, particularly that which has come out in the last 2 or 3 years. So as I said, a lot of our early work focused on the hill fort of Caerau Camp, and you can see here one of our excavations, wonderful aerial photograph by Toby Driver. This is our 2013 excavations, I think, in progress there. Maybe John might be in that photo, I don't know. But we know quite a lot about that hill fort now. So there were 4 main seasons of excavation at the hill fort, plus an additional season undertaken by Time Team. And we've got a pretty good idea of the kind of the sequence of activity there. Quite remarkably, underlying the hill fort are the remains of a Neolithic causewayed enclosure, which is one of the richest causeway. Well, it is the richest causewayed enclosure in terms of material culture in Wales, and the pottery assemblage in particular is very, very large. That seems to be occupied or used for perhaps a very relatively short period of time, perhaps only 100 years in the 35th, 34th centuries, Cal.BC. And then after that, it's abandoned, and there's very little evidence on the hilltop that anyone is actually doing anything of kind of real significance up there. By that, I mean there's probably no one living up there, probably for several thousands of years. In the Bronze Age, for instance, we have no evidence on the hilltop for people living there in the Bronze Age, or even going up onto the hill in the Bronze Age. But we know that people in the area are around at that time. We know that from the burial evidence, which I mentioned before. There's lots of barrows, for instance, to the south of the site. And we know that from the metalwork. All along the River Ely, there's a whole series of quite interesting, and in some cases quite spectacular, hoards of metalwork that have been placed in or around the River Ely. So we know that people are living in the area, if not on the hill itself. The hill fort, though, was constructed in the 8th to 6th centuries BC, so right at the end of the Bronze Age, so sort of that transitional period into the Iron Age. And it's intensively occupied over a very long period of time. We have lots of evidence of houses and houses that are sort of superimposed over the top of each other. And the hill fort has gradually expanded over time with the creation of its kind of multi-velation, so its series of triple ditches and ramparts on the northern and southern sides. And then largely abandoned around sort of the midpoint of the 1st century AD, so around about the sort of the campaigning period, before there is some reoccupation in the Romano-British period and later. Now, to those of you who have kind of researched hill forts, this is the familiar kind of story is that you can't really understand a hill fort unless you understand the landscape around the hill fort. And that's quite difficult here because most of that landscape around this hill fort has been built over mainly in the wake of the First and Second World Wars, so before archaeology was done as kind of standard before development. But our work in recent times has been to kind of look at this landscape around the hill fort, to kind of change our focus to the environs of the site. We know when people are up on the hill in the Neolithic and in the Iron Age, but what about the other times? Where are they during the Bronze Age? Where are they at the end of the Iron Age? Where do they go? What happens to the people that lived in the hill fort, for instance? We presume they moved back into the landscape, but where in the landscape? Now, one way we've kind of explored, we've explored that through a whole variety of ways, but one quite interesting way was during the hellscape of COVID. If you remember, when we couldn't leave our houses, we wanted to provide archaeological and historical kind of activities for people, and we asked local residents to get involved in doing mini digs, taking archaeology out into the kind of the landscape, out into their back gardens, and so we did a project where we asked, all these little red dots there you can see there are people who did mini digs in their gardens. And yes, they found lots of modern things, as you'd expect, but actually each of those red dots also represents a site where people found one of these things down here, a flint. And as we know, there's no natural flint in Wales. There might be some glacial flint and thing, but most flint shows that people has been brought there by people, and it's suggestive of a kind of a background, if you will, of sort of prehistoric activity that probably dates to the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. So we got, just from this kind of little project, it kind of gave us a sense that there were people living, or probably very, very close to the hilltop during that period when we know that they're not on the hill. If we wanted to find kind of structural remains, though, we needed to focus on a big open area, and the only big open area in this particular part of Cardiff is a leisure park. That's Trelai Park, which is I've just highlighted in red there on the eastern side of the estates. And so that's been where we kind of thought, okay, let's go and focus our attention down there and see if some of this kind of background activity that we can detect? Can we find kind of structural remains of prehistoric settlement? One of the other reasons we were interested in the park, or we thought that the park might be productive, is that in the centre of it is a known Roman villa, which was excavated in the late 19th century by John Story, and then in the early 20th century by Sir Mortimer Wheeler. So we knew that there's a high chance that there might be other archaeological remains in this particular area. And my hunch was that this wasn't a residence of a kind of incoming Roman. It was perhaps more likely to be the residence of, or the descendants, perhaps, of a native family, of a native elite family, who had become Romanized, for want of a better term. So my suspicion was that this might sort of have some kind of early Iron Age, late Iron Age origin to it. As many of the best discoveries seem to start with, we started with a geophysical survey led by Tim Young, working with local people. So this is a co-produced geophysical survey that's been done by school children and many other groups. And to our great surprise, or perhaps not to our great surprise, but we found to the south of the villa. So here's the villa in the centre of the park here. And the villa is just this building here with its kind of wing on its western side. And it's contained within a trapezoidal enclosure, a 3-ditch trapezoidal enclosure. The southern part of it, which had been disturbed by culverting in the 19th century. But to the south, we found what looked like on the geophysics to be another enclosure, and an enclosure that's slightly smaller than the one that the villa is contained in, but similar in shape. So it's that kind of trapezoid shape and univalate rather than multivalate. What intrigued me was that in the same place where we find the villa building in the larger enclosure, in this enclosure, there seemed to be a circular structure, which I've highlighted in red just there. And you could almost, well, it appears as if you could see the actual post holes of what we presume to be a roundhouse. It's quite an unusual thing to see on a magnetometry survey, but it suggested that there was perhaps a prehistoric settlement here. And my first thought was, here we are. Here's our late Iron Age precursor to the Roman villa. These kinds of enclosures are quite common in the Vale of Glamorgan. They're often called late Iron Age or Roman. Here we have one with a roundhouse in it. This is presumably the homestead of a family who's moved out of the Hillfort in the 1st century AD. And then after the conquest, they move again slightly to build their kind of Romanized, their very Romanized building in the center of the park. Almost, wonderful, lovely story there. Let's just put a little hole in it just to confirm that. But there's our narrative. Before I tell you about how wrong I was, I just wanted to kind of highlight a little bit about the topography. We are in the floodplain of the River Ely here. So the River Ely is just over to the east of, a couple of hundred meters to the east of where these sites are. But it's not a completely insane place to live. You can see from this map, I hope, that both of these sites actually sit on sort of the 10-meter contour. So they're actually about 5 meters or so higher than the river. So yes, a spectacular flood may flood these areas, but a normal kind of annual flood is unlikely to have gotten as far as where these two structures, these two settlements are. The other thing to say is that the park has been there's been various findings from the park over the years, including these two quite beautiful objects. These are early Bronze Age flat axes and a flanged axe just there, which perhaps did get my spidey senses tingling, let's say, that there might be something different going on. So we've now conducted 4 seasons of excavation. It took us about 2 days in our first season to realise that actually the story we had about this being an Iron Age settlement was completely wrong, because as soon as we put a spade in the ground, we started finding things and started finding handmade pottery, which you very rarely find in this part of the world during the Iron Age, and of a very distinctive style, which I'll talk about in a second. We've opened 5 trenches over the enclosure. You can see it. Well, there are 4 trenches here and a trench outside of the enclosure, which I won't talk about. There's a couple of really interesting things to kind of bear in mind. One is that the soil is quite acidic. It's sort of a clay silt, so bone doesn't survive very well. Burnt bone survives, but normal bone won't survive. And the silty soil makes it very, very difficult to see features. They resolve themselves for about half an hour after, when they're wet, and then they'll disappear. But the real significance of this site is that occupation deposits still survive in situ. This park has never been, as far as we can tell, deep ploughed. So if we were in the Vale of Glamorgan proper here, this whole area would have been ploughed away, and none of these occupation deposits would still survive. But we're in a park which has been a park for 70 or 80 years. Before that, it was pasture land. So the deep ploughing hasn't occurred here. So we actually have in situ occupation deposits surviving across this settlement. I'll talk a little bit about the kind of the boundary. So it's the enclosure is this sort of trapezoidal enclosure. It's about 50 meters by about 60 meters. It seems to have a gap on its southern side, just there, where we've got trench 3, which appears to be an entrance. We've explored the boundary in a number of locations, mainly in this sort of western area, and you can see that here from our first season. You can see quite a big, wide V-shaped ditch. It's being cut through by a drainage pipe, which is quite annoying, but that's means that the football pitches are nice and drained and not soggy for people. So it's about 2.5 meters wide. It's about 1.5 meters deep. It's on the inside of the ditch is a bank, and the rump of the bank still survives, which you can see. You can see it here, and on the top of that bank, a series of post holes, presumably representing some kind of fence line, which it's not revetting the bank. It's actually situated on top of the bank itself. The thing that really told us that this isn't an Iron Age settlement was this quite spectacular find from the enclosure ditch back in 2022. Here we had a complete pot that had been placed into the ditch. It was crushed through the weight of the overlying deposits, but the pot survives in its entirety, so we could assume that it went in complete. And it's decorated in a very particular style. It has this kind of horseshoe type decoration here, with the fingertip impressions, and then impressed cord running around the top of it. You can see it now reconstructed there by one of the wonderful conservators at the university, Leonie Mackenzie. And this type of pot, it's actually a mixture of 2 different styles. The horseshoe you would associate with kind of Devil Rimbri type pottery. The impressed cord would be perhaps more Treviska ware. This is a classic Middle Bronze Age vessel, big Middle Bronze Age storage jar or cooking vessel that had been placed into this ditch, and places our settlement not in the late Iron Age, but firmly into the Middle Bronze Age, so about 1500 BC, so about 1500 years older than I thought this site was going to be. The pot hadn't been placed on the base of the ditch. It wasn't in the primary fills. It was actually placed on the top of a secondary fill, which is about halfway up or so the ditch. So it had gone in some time after the ditch had kind of silted up and actually partially been backfilled. So it's not associated with the very first occupation at this site. But I think the occupation is constricted, or the activity is constricted to the Middle Bronze Age. So we're not talking about a lengthy kind of phase of activity at this site. We've partially explored the entrance into the enclosure as well. That required us going on the football pitch, which the people who play football don't really like. So, and we haven't been able to do any more than this little trench down here. But we've got the terminal of the ditch there, you can see, and the continuation of that sort of fence or timber boundary that's projecting out into the entrance here. I was rather hoping for some kind of spectacular place deposit in the terminal, but unfortunately there wasn't one. Maybe it exists in the other side, who knows. But it's the kind of the internal occupation which is the real sort of star of the show. And this is our trench 2, which is about sort of 10 meters by 10 meters. And it's placed directly over the top of the circular feature that we identified on the geophysical survey. And very quickly we recognized that there was occupation or floor deposits surviving. And so we've had to excavate this, or decided to excavate this, in a very methodical manner using a grid system, which I learned from Mike Parker Pearson when I was up in the Hebrides many years ago when he was digging at Clad Helen. And this allows us to take samples from every single one of these squares. So we've taken samples for XRF, but also for bulk samples, but also allows us to record very closely where we're finding material. So we could potentially build up a very detailed view of how these structures which exist here are being used. It's essentially, when fully excavated, it is basically a mass of post holes here. And the geophysical survey was just kind of picking out a few of these, which I'll talk about in a second. But there's also stratigraphy. It's not just post holes. There is stratigraphy here, which I've tried to highlight in this image. There are 2 occupation surfaces, which I'll call floor layers, so an upper and a lower. And they're associated with 2 circular structures. One of the surfaces sits over the top of some of those post holes, so we are able to pick out the sequence of those structures. And then in 2024, and we got down beneath both floor layers, we realized there was something underneath these structures as well. There was something else there that was defined by some quite large pits. So the first kind of phase of activity is what I've called a pit ? Circle, because I don't quite know how to interpret it at this point, and I'll come back to the interpretation of it later. But what we have here is these are 9 quite deep pits that are completely sealed by the floor layers of the later structures. And these pits contain lots of burnt material, and that's what you're seeing on the geophysical survey. That's why they were picked out in the magnetometer survey. And not only do they contain burnt material, which I suspect might have been posts or timbers that were in them, that have been removed, burnt, and then some of that material selected and placed back. They also contain other goodies, let's say. There's an early Bronze Age barbed and tanked arrowhead from this northern one, a complete pot base from this one over here, another almost complete pot from this, the pit down here, and other nice things from some of the others as well, which only just now we're starting to be able to explore. So there's some kind of structure beneath the later activity. I don't think it's a house because it's not associated with a floor surface, but we'll come back to that later. We certainly do, though, have 2 later houses, and I say later houses, they're only separated by perhaps a few decades, maybe even a few years. No later than that. This is all activity that's associated with the Middle Bronze Age. What we call our roundhouse 1 is associated with that lower floor surface, and it's quite a large structure, defined by a double post ring, so an inner and outer post ring, and a southeastern facing entrance, which kind of sort of funnels inwards rather than outwards, if that makes sense. Because we're on the football pitch, we were constrained by how big our trench could be. So there's the possibility that we might actually have another outer ring of posts, which that one there in the top right hand corner might be one of, which might represent where you've got the rafters of this structure actually sort of hitting the ground, if you will. It's about 10 meters in diameter. If it does have that sort of other ring, you might be talking about a structure that's maybe 13 meters or so in diameter. And there's lots of internal features. There's a central hearth, which I've highlighted here in orange, and a whole range of stake holes and post holes, which must represent screens and furniture and things like that. So lots of stuff going on within the interior of this house. You'll notice as well that lots of these post holes are very, very close together, especially on the southern and western side. And I suspect what you've got here are repairs. So rather than these all being structural elements, well, they are structural elements, but rather than all being part of the same structure, they're where people have repaired the house over time. It's Middle Bronze Age, and in the Middle Bronze Age, you get interesting stuff being put into features, often at particular key points. So when places are abandoned, for instance, and this structure does seem to have been taken down, so it's not something that's just left to rot away. That it actually seems to have been deconstructed with the posts removed. So some of the post holes are massive because the posts have actually been dug out, and into some of those post holes have been placed interesting things. And this one I've just picked out in particular because it's just here. And what you can see here is an inverted urn, an inverted cordoned urn. The interior of which contained soil with lots of burnt bone. So I suspect this is a cremation, perhaps a human cremation. Beneath that urn was another quite unusual feature, unusual object, which looks like half a donut, I guess. And Scott's looking very happy having got it out whole there. And what I think that is part of a furnace. So here is one of my colleagues, Tom, in one of our spoil heaps, doing some bronze casting for members of the public using a furnace which he's made with clay from the site. So that's what I think that object is. It's part of one of those. Here's Tom making his kind of modern one. And he was the first person to make any bronze in the park for perhaps 3,000 years. Sealing that house, we have another house with another floor surface that we call Roundhouse 2. This is architecturally less impressive. It's ovalish in shape rather than circular. It's only defined by a single post ring, but it shares that kind of southeastern facing entrance. And I think it also shares the hearth. I think the hearth has remained a feature of both houses. So I think the hearth is the kind of the central focus of both of these structures during both of the occupational phases of these buildings. Again, it's got kind of interesting stuff that's placed into the post holes at abandonment, including some quite beautiful ceramic loom weights. Half a quernstone, for instance, was found in a pit just inside the entranceway. This pit here, near to the hearth, contained a ceramic loom weight at the top, a layer of stones, and then a big burnt oak timber, which I have speculated may be even part of the loom, the household loom itself. The way that we've excavated this site in these half-meter squares means that we're just, it requires enormous amount of post-excavation work, but it allows us to try to kind of plot distribution maps of where we're getting finds. And what these distribution maps hopefully will tell us is where we have particular areas of activity within the house itself. And just plotting out a couple of those, this isn't all of the data, so this is just kind of a start, if you will. A couple of those show that the pottery seems to concentrate mainly around the centre of the house, around the hearth. Might be expected. That's where you're cooking. That's where you're preparing food. There's a good deal to the back of the hearth, and that seems to be mirrored in the location of where we find lots of the struck flint. That seems to concentrate at the back of the hearth. So maybe at the back of the hearth, away from the entrance, is where people are undertaking kind of the daily activity, the daily kind of craft activity in these structures. We've taken literally hundreds and hundreds of samples, bulk samples, which have been put through flotation by my wonderful volunteers. That has produced a quite significant carbonized plant remains assemblage, including the remains of barley and wheat. Very little chaff, suggesting that kind of part, that element of the sort of the harvest and threshing process is taking place elsewhere. Metalwork is very uncommon. So even though we might have part of a furnace, we have very, very little in terms of bronze or copper alloy itself. It's restricted to a handful of different little objects, like a little stud and an awl, perhaps. Lots of my students from the university have been working on the site and working on different elements of investigation. And one of them is Scott Bees, who's actually a local lad who's come on to degree with us and has been using a PXRF to look at some of the soil samples. Particularly, he's interested in the distribution of phosphates and copra. So there's some of the sort of the highlights. He's only done a quarter of the house at the moment. But some of the highlights of his work seems to show that you might have elevated phosphate levels in the western part of the house. Maybe that's where you might be storing animals or something at a certain time of the year. Copper seems to dominate around the hearth, so it might be that you have some sort of small scale metalworking going on around the hearth in this building. Those footballers wanted their football pitch back, cursors. So our work has kind of moved off the football pitches now to concentrate in the western part of the enclosure, and we've opened up quite a large area. This is our trench 5 over this kind of northwestern part of the internal area, and it's proved to be very complicated and lots of complex archaeology and lots of stuff going on. These are just some sort of initial findings. So we need to go back to this again this year. We're hoping to go back next year if all permissions are in place to finish things off. But we've got, again, an absolute mass of post holes, but again, an occupation deposit. So not a floor deposit, but some kind of deposit that contains material associated with occupation that's spread across this enclosure, through which and under which you have a whole raft of pits and post holes. And it's quite difficult to unpick what those patterns of those pits and post holes might be. My best guesstimate, I guess, if that's the right word at the moment, in this southern part, is that you've got different sized features. So all the ones highlighted in green here are post holes or pits with post pipes, which are all approximately 10 to 20 centimeters in diameter, which I suspect might be fence posts, for instance. And if you sort of link them together, then you sort of get some sort of weird dividing up or stalling of this area. It seems to make a little bit more sense when you look at the contents of some of the bigger features, the bigger pits. All of these ones here that have got B in contain burnt bone. This one here with P in contained this vessel here, again a cordoned urn, again contained burnt bone. I suspect these are burial. I suspect these are cremations, in fact. The bone doesn't survive very well, but I do suspect that these are cremations. So you might have sort of a dividing up. I don't know. Are these kin groups, family group? I don't know. I don't know what it is at the moment. These are just some initial ideas. But perhaps some kind of area set aside for burial. To the north of that, though, we have another couple of buildings, again associated with floor surfaces. We've only excavated part of these, but it seems that we have two further roundhouses. These are smaller than the other ones that we found in Trench 2. This would sort of fit the Middle Bronze Age model, where you tend to have a large building and a smaller ancillary building. So we're excavating this in the same way using our grid, and we're just now starting to try and understand if there are different material patterns, material residues from these houses. There certainly seems to be a lot more flint from these houses, which may or may not be important. In terms of dating, I said that it kind of, that we've got a range of radiocarbon dates. We're very grateful to the Cambrians in particular for funding many of these. And they allow for, we haven't modeled those dates yet, but the sort of the period that's allowed for from those dates is about 1600 to 1200, but I suspect that it's actually much tighter than that. I suspect we're seeing something from about 15 to 1400, something is maybe perhaps only 100 years of kind of occupation. The ditch is interesting because we got a very early date from the base of the ditch. And there's some debate at the moment about whether that's residual material or whether we have an earlier enclosure, which is then used for a settlement at a later date. What we do know, though, is that the site does see some reuse, and some reuse possibly contemporary with the Roman villa. We have a lot of Roman coins, for instance, from the overburden, so from the topsoil. We also have a range of other material, again, from that overburden, so stuff that's been churned up perhaps when they were levelling the park out. We have an iron spearhead, some glass beads, spindle whorl, and a number of brooches. One of the three of the coins now are of particular importance because they are early 5th century coins. So this is a 3 emperor type. So we have 3 of these, which I'm led to, well, my friend Nick Wells tells me are the 3 latest Roman coins ever found in Wales. So it suggests we've got some kind of, there is something going on in the 5th century AD. We assume associated with the villa. Wheeler suggested the villa was abandoned in the 330s, so this might push that story on maybe 80, 90 or so years. And why have you got bronze coinage? This isn't bullion. This is suggestive of a kind of a monetary economy still in operation. So there's little sort of suggestions of quite interesting things going on. So just to finish then, some emerging narratives, because this is emerging work, so this is ongoing work. But this type of enclosure, this type of settlement is quite unprecedented in Wales, really. It is if you were in Cranbourne Chase or other parts of southern Britain, an enclosure that looked like this would be relatively commonplace. These used to be called Martin's Down enclosures, and the classic example would be something like South Lodge. So Trelai Park morphologically kind of fits that pattern. It looks a bit like one. The issue, though, is that the dating of Trelai Park is somewhat different to those kind of English examples. At those, South Lodge and others, it's thought that the enclosure, the ditch itself, is one of the latest features on the site. If you have kind of open settlement, which is then enclosed. But at Trelai Park, the enclosure ditch must be the earliest feature. So we've got a very early date from it, but it's also got that kind of wonderful Middle Bronze Age pop with another radiocarbon date of 1500 BC from halfway up the ditch. So the ditch must be early. So we've got something slightly different going on here. The other question is, what is the thing underneath those 2 roundhouses? I called it a pit circle, but what actually is it? It could be a house, for instance. Is it a 3rd house, or is it the earliest house? So I mean, that's a possibility. The reason I don't necessarily think it is a house is that it's not associated with a floor surface, and unless it's been completely scoured away, which is, I guess, possible. That seems unlikely, given that the other 2 floor surfaces survive so well in situ. My hypothesis is that we might have something that we could call a pit circle, perhaps even a timber circle, so some kind of other sort of monument or structure that predates the occupation predates the houses, if you will. And there are examples of these kinds of things from other parts of southern Britain. Is that kind of structure, is that whatever it is a gathering, an area where people gathered, it's replaced by this quite spectacularly kind of architecturally complex house around about 1500 or so BC. And I guess the question, well, there's all sorts of questions here, but are these actually permanently occupied? Are they actually houses? When we look at the kind of material culture associated with them, yes, we have loom weights and things suggesting textile manufacture, but there are other parts of the suites of kind of material culture that are missing. We don't have awls, for instance, or we don't have spindle whorls. So there are elements of activity which aren't represented at this site, and I wonder if this is perhaps only semi-permanently occupied, perhaps by a still relatively mobile group who gather here at certain times of the year. The later significance of the site does seem to have some importance. The enclosure shape, for instance, is mirrored by that of the Roman villa, and I wonder if the villa is mirroring this kind of feature, which must still have been a topographic feature in the Roman period. The fact that you've got lots of coins, you've got lots of brooches, might suggest that it's a place of significance, social significance, perhaps a place of deposition. And when you start to talk in those kinds of terms, you start to think about things like rural shrines or something like that. Interestingly, we did some additional geophysics this year, and just inside the entrance is a very square-looking feature just there, which I'm pointing at it with that red arrow. And we're hoping that we're given permission to go back onto the football pitch just to put a little keyhole trench into that this year to understand what that might be. Is that something associated with this later activity? Huge numbers of people involved, and I can't thank them all, but I do want to, there's just so many people involved in this project. We've had thousands of people come and see us, literally hundreds of people involved in all aspects of the work, and continuing to do so. So thank you to everybody who has been involved. If you want to find out more, get in contact with me, or you could watch Digging for Britain from back in 2024, where we featured there, if you haven't done already. Anyway, thank you.